Actions speak louder than words. And so, what will the Falcons do in this year's draft that will speak volumes?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Monopoly Go. I admit it, I have a competitive side, and it is a big fan of Monopoly Go, the mobile hit twist on classic Monopoly. So join your friends, download Monopoly Go, now free on the App Store or Google Play. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka Sirius Black, aka a whole bunch of other AKAs. But I get so much feedback from you guys that some of you guys hate the AKAs, but I'm going to keep doing it because I enjoy the AKAs. And ultimately, I'm going to do what I do because I got a microphone and you have to listen to me. I don't have to listen to you. But I've been covering the Falcons for far too many years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. And I think each and every one of you guys that is an everydayer, even the ones that skip over the AKAs, right? Appreciate you. Everybody that makes this illustrious podcast their first watch or first listen of the day. All you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So we got a jam-packed show for you today. We won't be talking about the Falcons not losing picks over tampering like we did on yesterday's episode. We did get an update that the NFL will not conclude their investigation of the Falcons' alleged tampering with the signing of Kirk Cousins, as well as the Eagles tampering allegedly with Saquon Barkley before the draft. So if the Falcons and Eagles lose picks, it will be in the 2025 draft, not the 2024 draft. The other thing we got today was Terry Fontenot speaking to the media. And, I don't think he really said anything of note in the press conference. It was a lot of Terry-isms, Terry talk, whatever you want to call it. Best player available. We believe in makeup and character. We're open to doing anything. Sort of the classic GM speak of like saying a whole lot of nothing, right? But it does beg the question, like, what really is Terry going to tell us? And I think we'll get our answers on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Win the draft on night 1, night 2, and in day 3 of the draft, because actions speak louder than words. And I think this is a very intriguing draft for the Atlanta Falcons because, with the hiring of Raheem Morris and with that sort of pressure to win, there's clearly like this kind of 2-year window kind of hanging over this Falcon team. And essentially, when you look at the way this roster is kind of constructed, it's sort of designed where, their goal is to try to get the most out of these next 2 years, right? Kirk Cousins has 2 years worth of guarantees on his contract, right? You have 2 years before you technically have to make you're forced to make any major financial decisions on second contracts with Kyle Pitts, Drake London, and Bijan Robinson, and if you're assuming there's not going to be any significant drop off from these 3 starters on your offensive line, 60% of your offensive line should be intact for another 2 years with Jake Matthews, Chris Lindstrom, and Caleb McGarry, right? And then you look at the defensive side of the ball. Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata both only have 2 years left on their contract. Arnold Ebiketie, Caden Ellis, Troy Anderson, Nate Landman also have basically 2 years left on their contracts. Jesse Bates has 3 years left on his contract. If AJ Terrell does get a contract extension at some point between now and the start of the season, it's likely the first 3 years will be guaranteed, and then we'll see, right? And so similarly to Jesse Bates, it's a 3-year window for him. And so, you can be pretty confident right now if you're the Atlanta Falcons looking at this roster in sort of this 2-year window where you can potentially maximize this. And the question is, how do you maximize it? And how does that influence this team's approach to the 2024 NFL draft? Now, we know that most players typically don't necessarily impact until like their 3rd and 4th years in the NFL. So does that mean that the Falcons lean a little bit more heavily towards players that may have a little bit more of a higher floor, that are maybe a little bit more NFL ready, right? Rather than leaning on the sort of typical draft picks, which are, you're waiting 3+ years for those guys to really hit their stride. And, that can be embodied in a lot of ways in the debate between Dallas Turner, the Alabama edge rusher, and Laiatu Latu, the UCLA edge rusher, who are currently, according to FanDuel, both even odds, plus 250 to be the 8th overall selection in the draft, right? We look at a player like Turner, all the tools, all the traits that we're looking for, but he's a little rawer than, Latu is and a lot of other pass rushers that, typically get drafted that high. And so it's probably going to take the better part of 3 years for him to develop, right? Meanwhile, Latu is much more ready, right? And if your goal is to kind of maximize this 2-year window, it would seem that Latu is a much better bet to be able to contribute at a higher level in that 2-year window, right? But let's be clear. This is how I view the Atlanta Falcons. Like internally, and we know Terry and Raheem listen to the pod. They're everydayers. They may be listening to this pod going like, that's not at all how we see it. We don't see this 2-year window. We think it's a 5-year window or a 10-year window or something like that. But this is just kind of how I see where the Falcons are as they sit here right now. And it's going to beg the question of where are they going to be after this 2-year? Where are they going to be when we're coming to the end of the 2025 season and heading into 2026? Are we going to be talking about this team being one of the top teams in the NFL that's competing at the highest levels in the league, that we're sitting there being like, let's run it back, even though, we have to restructure some contracts and re-sign some guys, let's run it back, right? Similar to what we saw Dan Quinn and company do post 2016, right? We might be going into year 3 of the Raheem Morris regime and hearing several prominent media members from the national football media sort of picking the Falcons to be their, Super Bowl pick in 2026. Or we could be sitting here at the end of 2025, heading in 2026, being like, this team isn't also ran, right? They couldn't get over the hump. And, whether that's winning a playoff game, whether that's, making the playoffs, and we're going into year 3 of Raheem Morris being like, that seat is warming up, right? And we're talking about, how can we kind of cleanly blow this thing up and sort of reset this thing and rebuild this thing, right? So who knows where we'll be in 2 years, right? We shall see. But I think this draft is an important aspect that's going to help determine it. Now, I'm not going to go and like it all depends on the draft. I think the drama that, fans tend to get, like everything rides on this draft pick in this draft class, tends to get overstated, right? The draft does matter, but I think football, you can course correct, right? Often your success in football, I think, especially in the NFL, is often dictated by your ability to successfully course correct, right? I use the example constantly of why Ozzie Newsome was a better general manager than Thomas Dimitroff, because Dimitroff would draft the player high and double down on that guy developing. While Ozzie was like, look, we win some, we lose some, right? Courtney Upshaw is the prime example I've used many times on the podcast in the past. He was their top pick in the 2012 draft in the second round to be Terrell Suggs' running mate opposite him. Didn't work out after that first year. And guess what they did? They went out and signed an all-pro in Elvis Dumervil in 2013 and proceeded to prosper, right? And you also see this sort of course correction ability manifest itself in that next man up mentality during the course of a season, right? Your star player gets hurt. How do you course correct? How do you adjust to not having that star player? Because your ability to win football games is going to matter at that point. So the draft definitely is going to matter when it comes to this, but it's part of the reason why, like, I don't necessarily go into these drafts being like, if they do this one thing, if they do X, this is good. If they do Y, it is bad, right? Because, my thing is just like, just get good players and generally it's going to work itself out in your favor in general, right? Just focus on that, right? But I also don't think there's really a wrong answer to how this team approaches the conversation around whether or not there's this 2-year window. Sure, you can absolutely draft high floor guys that are going to potentially maximize this 2-year window, but you can also look at it from the perspective of, a large percentage of your players, especially on defense, and especially on the front seven, may not be here in 2026. And so let's start laying the foundation for who are going to be the core players on, 3+ years from now, rather than looking at it from, we have this 2-year window that we got to maximize. Let's see if we can expand that window to 5 years, right? Because we're able to sort of retain a strong core after this 2-year window. So how the Falcons decide to answer that question is fascinating to me. And is really what Terry is going to tell us, on Thursday and Friday and Saturday, as opposed to anything he said on Tuesday. But I do want to talk a little bit more about these top 3 edge rushers, right? Take a deeper look at the ways that they win as, part of this conversation. And we'll do that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Passion, drive, patience. It is the formula for winning championships and it's also what's going to keep your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and so much more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, that's going to come back, right? eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay guaranteed fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash, baby. With all the parts you need, the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay guarantee fit only available to U.S. customers. So, guys, check out the Locked On NFL mock draft, available now. The ultimate 6-part series available on Locked On NFL Draft podcast, either on YouTube or your preferred podcast platform, with the local Locked On experts like myself selecting for their respective teams in the first round and some in the second round. Check out Locked On NFL mock draft, available now on Locked On NFL Draft on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. So, I've gone through the film of these top 3 edges: Dallas Turner of Alabama, Latu Latu of UCLA, and Jared Verse of Florida State in recent weeks, as part of a series of film breakdowns I did for each guy in the last 3 weeks for the Locked On Falcons Insider. If you want to check out those film breakdowns, you can get a 14-day free trial if you sign up at the link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. So go check that out if you want. But how I kind of stack these edges, I have Turner at the top, Latu number 2, and Verse number 3. And the oversimplification is, talking about eBay Motors, speed, power, or style, right? Speed, power, or technique, right? Is sort of the simple ways that you can win as an edge rusher in the NFL. And I've talked about this before. We talked about this a ton when we were breaking down Arnold Ebiketie and D'Angelo Malone and Zach Harrison in recent years in their post-draft, right? And talking about the ways that those guys won, right? And basically, the argument I've presented before is this is an oversimplification, but speed is going to beat the slow guys, power is going to beat the weak guys, but technique is going to beat everybody, right? And I'm going to revise that statement somewhat, but when I look at these 3 guys, and that's kind of why I stack them the way I do, I have Turner at the top because I think he has the potential. He's not there yet. He's still developing. He has the potential to win in all 3 ways: with speed, with power, with technique. Now, right now, his probably most developed pass rush move is his long arm, which is more of a power move. He also has a rudimentary chop move. He doesn't really win reliably with speed, and that's why I kind of think, you get him in the right building, right coaching, right development. I think his floor is higher than people think, but we'll see if he can develop into that. And certainly I think it's fair to question whether or not the Falcons are going to be able to develop a player like Dallas Turner, right? I know Raheem Morris is, pushing hard that we're going to develop and we're going to maximize all the players in this building, but every coach says that, that's classic coach speak. So, again, we'll see. Actions speak louder than words. We'll see in your actions whether or not you are actually successful in pulling it off. Now, we'll circle back to Latu in a second, but why I have Verse at the bottom is I think he mostly wins just with power, right? His go-to move besides a bull rush, he does have a chop move, but I don't think that chop move is going to be very effective at the next level, because I just don't think Verse has the bend to really maximize that ability. And so I think that's going to lead Verse to be much more of a pressure guy at the next level, as most power rushers tend to be, or at least guys that are only power rushers tend to be, right? Because it's harder to disengage from that offensive line. And you can kind of collapse the pocket very easily, but getting off that guy in order for you to wrap up and sack the quarterback, it becomes harder at that point. Now, Latu is in the middle, because I think Latu is exceptional from a technical standpoint, from a stylistic standpoint, right? He's got lots of style, right? But I wonder if he can win with the speed and the power. Not a whole lot of that on his film, right? Now, his go-to move is a cross chop, and it's deadly, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. But I do wonder, is there a significant speed or power element to his game? And that's where I kind of revised my previous statement, where I've said, technique beats everybody. But I wonder now, today, that I didn't necessarily wonder a year or two ago when talking about Arnold Ebiketie and Zach Harrison and talking about their technical abilities as pass rushers. Can you win just with technique, right? Because I think the technical abilities of NFL offensive tackles, there's a significant jump from the college level to the NFL level versus the guys that you're going to be facing regularly at the next level, right? You look at Jake Matthews is a great example of this, right? Jake is very good against speed. He's very good against technical pass rushers. He's a little susceptible to power. And most high-level NFL offensive tackles, are going to be able to check two of those boxes. They're going to be able to negate at least two, if not three, right? The elite guys, the Trent Williamses of the world, right? They're negating all three of those things. And that's why, those guys give up like 12 pressures a year, right? And like, to me, this is like Jake good against technical rushers, because I remember during Nick Bosa's record-setting rookie season where he broke like every rookie pass rush record ever, he didn't do anything against Jake Matthews in that like week 15 game against the 49ers. And Bosa's as technical a pass rusher as we've seen come into the NFL in recent memory, right? Now, Bosa did play well that week. He was able to beat, the other four offensive linemen that the Falcons had on that Sunday, which, I think is another interesting aspect of Latu, where there is some overlap between him and Bosa a little bit in that regard. But it's why I wonder if Latu's ceiling is maybe a little bit lower than many would assume, based off of he's one of the most productive college pass rushers ever, right? Since PFF has been, calculating and I can't think of the word, doing the stats for college players. Doing stats. That's the technical term for like the last 10, 12 years or whatever it has been. But I think it's a legit question, right? Why wasn't he winning with speed and power, right? Is it because he can't win with speed and power? Or is he just simply didn't win with speed and power? Like, it's basically a question of, is he incapable of winning in those ways? Or did he simply not have to win those ways because his technique was so good, right? I don't have the answer to that question, but I tend to lean more that it's a can't than a didn't. But that's going to be the unanswered question with Latu. And certainly if you think it's a didn't, then you're probably a lot higher on Latu in terms of what his ceiling could be at the next level. And you may see him as that Nick Bosa type of player. Now, I also think Nick Bosa had the speed and power elements of his game, those boxes checked compared to Latu. But, we'll see. We'll see. Again, I could be lowballing Latu in that regard. And he may be able to unlock those abilities at the next level. And that gets us to where I want to wrap today's episode, because I want to talk more about the journey that I've gone on with Latu, where I was extremely high on him at the start of this offseason, and now I'm lower. And I'm sure some of you guys are like, wait, you changed your mind? Like, that's not possible. Like, you have to die on a hill. Like, that's how this whole thing works. But, I want to talk about how that journey went, and also some of the other things that he's bringing to the table should he be the Atlanta Falcons pick. And we'll do that to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So, guys, I try to keep my competitive side tamped down, but sometimes you just got to unleash it. And one of the ways I feed my competitive side is with Monopoly Go. I'm sure you've heard of it because it's been downloaded over 150 million times. That's probably the exact number of cross chops that Laiatu Latu has put on film over the last 2 years. It's Monopoly Go is a great twist on Monopoly, and you can play on not one, but hundreds of Monopoly boards in crazy locations. You can build amazing cities that are going to bring you in big money. And the best part is you can have fun with your friends. And by fun, I mean absolutely messing with them and destroying them like Laiatu Latu does to your average Pac-12 offensive tackle. And, you can charge them rent on iconic properties, just like classic Monopoly. You can rob their vaults, so their money becomes my money, right? Team up with friends, show your competitive side to people all around the world in time tournaments to earn huge rewards. So get in the game and join your friends. Download Monopoly Go now for free on the App Store or Google Play. So, guys, let's wrap up today's episode. Tomorrow, your first listen will be joined, I think, by Jarvis Davis for our last pre-draft episode. And at the end of today's episode, I'll tell you sort of my plans for Thursday night and the rest of the weekend. But the journey I've been on with Laiatu Latu has been long and circuitous, right? One of my first impressions of him came in January of 2023 when he absolutely destroyed my beloved Pitt Panthers in a bowl game. We had our backup left tackle, I think it was, in that game, and he just got ripped a new one. And it was rough to see. And it was one of the most impressive, one of the most dominant single player performances. And instantly I fell in love with Laiatu Latu. I was ready at that point even before the 2023 draft, he's better than Will Anderson, right? He's better, already better. And he's only got another year of development to go. But, the Love Fest kind of slowed down. It kind of hit a snag this past fall where he kind of had a relatively quiet game, at least for the quarter of the game that he went toe-to-toe with Oregon State's Taliase Fuaga, who's potentially going to be a top 15 pick in this year's draft. And so, I was like, okay, it's a one-off. Everybody has a bad game every now and then. And so I was very eager to see what he would do at the Senior Bowl, right? Because, I wanted to see if he could win in different ways than the usual, swipes and swims and all the stuff that he does so well, right? And if you're an everydayer of this podcast, you knew I was hyped going into the Senior Bowl week, being like, oh, we're going to be talking a lot about Latu. And then you kind of heard me being kind of underwhelmed coming out of Mobile with it, because I think he basically, just did the same things he's always done. And I don't think the swipes and the swims and all that stuff were as effective at the Senior Bowl in the one-on-ones as, they are in the games. Right. And is that a coincidence that, several of the offensive tackles he was facing in those Senior Bowl one-on-ones are potential top 50 picks? You tell me. But, that's how I sort of see and why I think his ceiling is a little lower. Right. Because I think as you level up the competition, his production goes down. Right. Which is true of all players. Right. But, to me, it's a disparity. Right. But that's why, I'm lower on Latu's ceiling, but I'm very high on his floor, right? That cross chop is absolutely deadly, right? And we've talked several times over the last couple of years about, DeArnold Edekettis and D'Angelo Malone's. Can they develop a cross chop a la Yannick Ngakoue, right? Who has had a deadly cross chop since he came into the NFL, has been a reliable, up until this past year, 8-sack guy every single year, primarily using that cross chop. And so for that reason, like, I sit here and I go like, Latu should be able to use that just as effectively as Ngakoue and should be, day one an 8-sack guy. Right. But, one of the frustrating things watching more and more film, as I have done in recent weeks on Latu, is like, you didn't always get to see him going up against the best of the best. Right. And it's a negative because it's frustrating, because it's like, I want to see more of him against Taliase Fuaga than a quarter worth of game. I want to see more than 10 snaps going up against Jordan Morgan, another potential top 50 pick. Right. And we're not seeing the best on best, but college coaches get paid too. They get paid to win. Right. And so it's a positive, I think, for Latu, even if it's a negative for his evaluation. Right. My personal frustrations with not being able to evaluate best on best, but it's a positive because oftentimes he wasn't facing the opposing team's best offensive tackle. He's often facing the weakest offensive lineman. Right? Whether that's a guard or a tackle. And, again, UCLA coaches know what they're doing, right? even if it's frustrating from a draft standpoint. Right. And that was one of the things I like about Latu, is how effective he was going up against guards, because, it's why I like Latu in Atlanta, but I would probably love him maybe in another city on another team, because of their potential to line him up more on the interior than he probably would in Atlanta, with the presences of Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata, right? That he may not get as many one-on-ones in those obvious passing downs that I could see him dominating at the next level, right? Like, I look at a team like the Rams, right? Like, they could put together a NASCAR package on like 3rd and long, where they have Michael Hoyt and Byron Young on the outside, Kobe Turner on the inside, and guess who's replacing Aaron Donald? It's Laiatu Latu. Right. We saw the Rams do this for the last, decade with Aaron Donald. They would move him around to get him favorable matchups. And I think Latu has that same type of ability because of that technical wizardry, right? That I think his technical and his hand uses is going to be even more effective against guards than it is against tackles, for a variety of reasons. Right. And it's like the idea of like, if I'm a defensive coach and I have Latu and I'm facing the Atlanta Falcons, like, I can move him around the formation to get him matched up against whatever offensive lineman. I'm like, that guy has the weakest technique of any other offensive lineman. So on these obvious passing downs, we're going to feature you in that matchup so that you can consistently win and beat that guy. So for example, if I'm facing the Falcons, I'm circling Matthew Bergeron, third and long, Laiatu Latu, you're lining up against Bergeron because his tendency to double punch. And, that swim, that swipe, that chop is going to absolutely destroy any offensive lineman that double punches, which is what so many college offensive linemen do. And, if you do that in the NFL, you'll be out of the league in 2 or 3 years. So we'll be paying attention to Matthew Bergeron's technique this year as one of the reasons why he makes a year 2 jump. But I do think Latu is a natural fit in this Falcons 3-4 defense. I think he's very natural and very comfortable rushing from a 2-point stance. Like, you contrast it with Jared Verse, who I think is way better rushing from a 3-point stance and the 2-point stance, much more explosive coming out of 3-point stance. Dallas Turner's kind of in between worlds. I think it's just part of like the quote unquote rawness of Dallas Turner. Like, he hasn't really mastered anything. So it's just like, he's just kind of, again, this not completely raw piece of clay, but like, he is much more moldable in terms of what he can be in the future. So I do like Latu in Atlanta. I would love Latu in LA as one example, but I do think he could be a very good player here in Atlanta. And for all the reasons, it totally makes sense if the Falcons do decide to take Laiatu Latu, even if he isn't my top edge rusher. I'm like, who cares, right? Like if the Falcons, like, they'll get the benefit of the doubt until they don't, right? Like, no one's going to sit here and be like, how could, I mean, I'm sure there will be somebody out there that's like, how could you take Laiatu Latu over Dallas Turner or Jared Verse? But like, if you can't understand why a team would choose any one of these 3 guys over the other, depending on their circumstances and what they're looking for, then like, that's an you issue. Like, you're not thinking hard enough. And again, for a lot of the reasons we've already discussed, like, there are plenty of reasons why the Falcons would choose Laiatu Latu, one of which is, having the high floor. But again, I still sit here about 48 hours from the Falcons pick, thinking that Turner is likelier to be the pick than Latu, but we'll see. Right. And again, a lot of that is based off of the team's recent draft tendencies over the last 3 years that we discussed. One of these mock draft Mondays, either this past Monday or the previous Monday. I can't remember which one it was. They all blur together, guys. But like, that's another aspect of this. Like, we've sat here and thought, okay, well, these are the tendencies we've seen under Terry Fontenot over the last 3 years, but they could break those tendencies of the Raheem Morris, right? And that's another intriguing aspect that we might learn about this draft. In addition to, are they trying to maximize the 2-year window? It's like, how much of those tendencies, the way that they've done things the last 3 years, how much of that is a Terryism versus an Arthur Smithism, right? We'll have an answer, on Saturday or Sunday. So I'm sure that will be a topic of discussion, this weekend and next week. And speaking of this weekend and next week, again, tomorrow plan is to have one last sort of final full pre-draft show with Jarvis Davis of Locked On Sports Atlanta. Maybe we'll talk about the tampering stuff or whatever else is coming to mind, or maybe we'll actually give Matt Ryan his flowers for once on this podcast. But my tentative plan, and again, plans might change. I'll have to hit up, my supervisors at the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, to see sort of if there's a network-wide sort of initiative that they want to do. But my initial plan, the last couple of years, they've kind of let us do our own thing. So if I'm going to do my own thing, I'll probably wind up doing like another live show at 7:30 Eastern time on Thursday night, leading into the kickoff of the first round at 8:00, and then probably around 11:30 midnight, whenever the round 1 wraps up, we'll do another live show recapping it. So you guys will have the opportunity to, actually give me the feedback in the chat and whatnot, rather than just, talking amongst yourselves. So that is my plan for Thursday night. And then, of course, Friday, we'll do another recap show. If we need to do, if there's other topics worth discussing during the day, we might do, a Friday pre-show or whatever. Usually I don't do that, but like, we'll see. We'll sort of see. Usually I can, usually like, here's what they got to do on day 2 at the end of the day one recap. So, and then of course, Saturday we'll do another recap once the draft is all wrapped up, and then, Sunday. So you guys are going to get a show every day this weekend and all next week. So usually I run out of gas by the time we get to the Thursday after the draft, because, I've done like 10 or 12, 13 or whatever the number is, straight shows in a row. But that is our plan right now, guys. I really appreciate you. If you tune in to whatever future episodes we do, continue to make us your first listen here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day.